Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us here at the Heritage Foundation in our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on our heritage.org website on all of these occasions and would ask everyone in-house to make that courtesy check that your cell phones have been turned off as we prepare to begin. We will, of course, post the program within 24 hours on the Heritage homepage for everyone's future reference. And our internet viewers are always welcome to send questions or comments at any time, simply emailing us at speaker@heritage.org. As you would have noted when you came in, we do have copies of our guest speaker's book today available out in the foyer. He will be signing them up here afterwards and carrying on conversations following the public program as well. So do please avail yourself of that opportunity. Hosting our discussion today is Bruce Klingner, Senior Research Fellow for Northeast Asia in our Asian Studies Center. Mr. Klingner has 20 years' experience in the intelligence community, working at the CIA and Defense Intelligence Agency. From 1996 to 2001, he was the Deputy Chief of Korean Issue Group in the CIA's Directorate of Intelligence. Before joining us at Heritage, Mr. Klingner spent several years at the Eurasia Group, a global political risk assessment firm, as their Korean analyst, and previously he worked as the Director of Analysis and Senior Asia Analyst at the Intellibridge Corporation. Please join me in welcoming my colleague, Bruce Klingner. Bruce?
Thanks very much, John, and thank all of you for coming for this book event. It's truly a pleasure for me to welcome my colleague and my friend, Bruce Bechtol, to Heritage. And Bruce and I met when he was at DIA and I was at CIA more years ago than either one of us would like to admit, I'm sure. Now, many experts in Washington discuss North Korean military issues, and they toss out generalizations and witticisms about the status and particularly the capabilities of the North Korean military, particularly the conventional forces. But very few actually have any real expertise in military analysis or North Korean military issues. And Bruce Bechtol is an exception. His background as a U.S. Marine provided him an inherent knowledge of military unit disposition and missions, and then as an intelligence officer at the Defense Intelligence Agency and later senior analyst for Northeast Asia at the Joint Staff J2, that's the Intelligence Directorate. He worked, really worked North Korean military issues as, I would argue, only an intelligence analyst really can. And since he's actually one of the very few outside of the intelligence community who, for example, knows where the North Korean 815th Mech Corps' AOR is, knows whether the 820th Corps is armored, artillery, or mechanized, as well as what the capabilities of the long-range artillery systems that North Korea has. And in recent years, it had seemed to become an analytic truism that we didn't need to worry about North Korea's conventional forces, that we only really needed to focus about the nuclear issue and then the long-range missile issue. Analysts and experts were very dismissive of this caricature of the crazy little guy in Pyongyang who was hoarding his nukes, and that was all we had to worry about. And, like a voice in the wilderness, Bruce was one of the few that was warning both Washington and Seoul that we had to take North Korea's military capabilities and conventional capabilities, particularly the asymmetric capabilities, we couldn't take those for granted, that we had to focus on that. And the unfortunate and the tragic 2 acts of war by North Korea in 2010 against the Cheonan and Yangpyeong-do served as a deadly reminder that we had to focus on and had to maintain defenses against the wide spectrum of North Korea's conventional military threat. And Pyongyang's rash of threats this year, the 6 to 8 weeks of threats that we all experience, particularly military movements and very specific threats against South Korean targets in the West Sea, show that threat remains. So now the title of Bruce's book is The Last Days of Kim Jong-il, and I don't think I'm giving away too much of the book if I say that the last days of Kim Jong-il were very similar to the first days of Kim Jong-un, and that not much has changed between father and son. And that Kim Jong-un, certainly since his ascension to power, has demonstrated he's no less belligerent, no less dangerous than his father and his grandfather. So some of the questions that Bruce poses in his book, and perhaps we'll address today, are what kind of threat does the North Korean military pose to the region? Why has North Korea stepped up its violent military provocations, and how have Pyongyang's dealings with non-state actors that engage in terrorism affect stability? Now, for those of you who know Bruce, as is typical with Marines, he's very soft-spoken. He's very timid in arriving at his conclusions, and he's very hesitant to let you know if he disagrees with your analysis. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming my friend Bruce Bechtol.
Well, as Bruce Klingner said, we've been friends for a very long time, and I have a great deal of respect for his analysis. In fact, I can tell you that Bruce Klingner's analysis of a new missile division in North Korea is actually in my book, quoted in my book, which was an analysis he wrote here at Heritage. And I'd like to thank Bruce and the Heritage Foundation for having me here today and allowing me to get my research out there. I'm most grateful to both Bruce and to the Heritage Foundation for that. My book is dedicated to my wife and daughter. For those of you who are not people who know me personally, as Bruce does, and some of you others in the audience, I had a quadruple heart bypass October 29th. And once I got past that, my wife and daughter pushed me to finish writing this book. Why, I don't know, except maybe it got me out of the living room and into my office, who knows. But it's dedicated to them. And next to last, I'd like to thank Angelo State University, where I came here from in Texas, which for the fourth year in a row made Princeton Review's list of best colleges and universities in the country, one of only 3 public universities in Texas to be named so. And we're pretty justifiably proud of what we give our students out there. And finally, I'd like to thank all of you for coming. I truly appreciate you coming and hearing what hopefully you won't consider my rantings. But I'm happy to talk to you about North Korea, and I look forward to answering your questions when I'm done. So please allow me to get, excuse me, and I have a cold. You have my apologies for that. Please allow me to get into the meat of it and why I wrote this book. I really started writing this book when Kim Jong-il was still alive, but it was about a year before he died. So with Kim Jong-il's death in 2011, a great deal of discussion ensued about what it means for the region and for us, and I'm sure many of you read those pieces. But perhaps because Kim's death is so recent, almost no literature has been published that specifically discusses the impact Kim Jong-il's last years as the leader of the DPRK had and will have on the future of North Korea. The objective of the book, The Last Days of Kim Jong-il, is to show how the Kim Jong-il government in North Korea used foreign and domestic policies to pose a multifaceted threat to the national security of the United States and its key allies, and, just as importantly, to maintain the power of the Kim family regime, or as my friend Dave Maxwell calls it, the KFR, once the dear leader passed from the scene. So this book analyzes how the final years of the Kim Jong-il regime exacerbated the threats that North Korea has and continues to pose to the region and to the nation states with an interest in it. Now, the way I approached this was I picked a few key issues. I didn't pick all issues. I picked a few key issues that remain important for us today. And before I get into these issues, I would like to point out something that several of you, I think, would agree with me. What we are watching Kim Jong-un do today, what we've been watching him do for the past 8 months, is a script. Sorry about that. A script that was written for him before he took over. A script probably crafted by his father and his father's cronies. We're not seeing anything surprising to those of you who understand North Korea. I'm sure you'd agree with me on that. So the key things that I picked that were key in my mind were, one, Bruce talked about it briefly, North Korea's evolving conventional military threat. I have a whole chapter in there that talks about how that threat evolved. The capabilities they maintained, the capabilities they brought to the fore that they had not had before, and the capabilities they improved. The next chapter, I tie actual operations into that, and that chapter is, I spend a whole chapter on the Northern Limit Line and North Korea's strategy in the Northern Limit Line, where they take these conventional military capabilities and they attack the South using them. Largely asymmetric capabilities, I might add. I also have a chapter on how North Korea's nuclear capabilities evolved during the last years of Kim Jong-il. And there's probably a lot of you here who are political scientists. I'm a political scientist. This chapter does not focus hardly at all on the politics of North Korea's nuclear program. Instead, it focuses on what does North Korea have? What are their capabilities? How will North Korea attack us if they decide to attack us? What kind of platforms? What do they have right now? What are they working on? When will it be ready? And perhaps most importantly, how will the ROK-US alliance counter a nuclear attack? What will we do about it? What will be our countermeasures if North Korea actually mounts a nuclear attack? And another chapter that I wrote was North Korea's support to non-state actors who engage in terrorism, that is to say, terrorist activities. Why did I write a chapter specifically on that? Well, two reasons. One, their support to non-state actors who engage in terrorism picked up in the Kim Jong-il regime, particularly the last 5 years or so. And two, because I keep hearing people say that North Korea should not be put back on the list of nations supporting terrorism because they don't support terrorism, which is simply not true. So in this chapter, I lay out the evidence for you all to see, and I hope you'll enjoy reading that. And finally, tied into all of this and nested throughout the whole book, including in the end, is the North Korean succession process and its chances for success. So by analyzing these 5 factors, the reader, hopefully all of you, you need to buy books, they're very cheap, will be able to understand how Kim Jong-il's government in its final years was able to function, to present a threat to its neighbors, and attempt to guarantee its success and existence through the regime succession process. Everything, let me stress this again, everything that is happening right now and has been happening since December of 2011 is happening because of the groundwork laid for and the planning that was conducted for current events. Thus, an analysis of the events that occurred during the last 3 years of the Kim Jong-il regime, moving into the first year and a half of the Kim Jong-un regime, will help us to understand the reasons for what is happening now, but more importantly, it will give us evidence to predict what will happen in the next 2 to 5 years. And that is what my book sets out to accomplish. So, if I may, please allow me to get into the meat of this brief. The 3 key questions that I seek to answer in my brief today and that I seek to answer in the book is, how did Kim Jong-il's last years affect what happened after his death? How stable is North Korea right now, and what does the next leader need to survive? Well, how did all this start? And why did I pick 2009? Well, what happened in 2008? Kim Jong-il had a stroke at the end of the summer of 2008, and he was pretty much out of it until January or February, there's some argument, of 2009. At the time he had the stroke, he also suffered from high blood pressure, diabetes, kidney problems, and heart problems. But other than that, he was okay. Despite all of this, think about this, despite all of this, Kim Jong-il did not begin the regime succession process until 2009. So the guy's just had a stroke, and now he's like, oh, I guess I need to start this succession thing. It was very obvious to everybody observing North Korea, and there's a lot of you in here that are my good friends, that Kim Jong-il was not long for this world. So how did the military evolve? What did Kim Jong-il do and his generals, guys like Kim Kyok-shik, who's a guy you'll probably see in the press a lot? How did they try and affect the military during the last few years of Kim Jong-il's regime? Well, one of the things Bruce mentioned before I started talking was asymmetric capabilities. They stepped up the asymmetric capabilities of what most people would consider their conventional forces. For example, long-range artillery, ballistic missiles that are not long-range, like Scuds, and special operations forces. They have 200,000 of them. We saw a lot of training going on. We saw an increase in the number of special operations forces. For example, they actually in 2006 literally converted a bunch of standard divisions to special operations forces divisions. They took all the artillery and armor out of the divisions, they spread it out along the DMZ, and they made these guys soft guys and jump qualified in the whole bit. That's an example of North Korea realizing what they had to do to make their military more capable of fighting today's warfare. Their missile and nuclear capabilities were pursued with high intensity. We saw that. Now, we saw, I think, the metamorphosis of this in December of 2012 when they successfully launched a 3-stage ballistic missile platform. So anyone who tells you, we don't know if they can hit Hawaii or Alaska or not, well, that's just not true anymore. They have the platform to do it, and it went through all 3 stages this time. And they did something that some of you may have friends that do. They wrapped up, and this just started about 3 years ago, their cyber warfare capabilities. So anybody have friends who has tape on their glasses and, cyber war, they stepped that up. Thousands of guys engaged in very serious cyber warfare attacks, as some of you who are from Korea know, on South Korean business, on South Korean government, on South Korean press, and my good friend Greg Scarlett, his website at HRNK was actually attacked. So very interesting stuff. SOF remained a key focus. I talked about that. Artillery upgrades continued. Why is that a big deal? Because as all of us who study North Korea knows, one of the key things about a war between North and South Korea is that a lot of people truly believe Seoul is held hostage by that artillery along the DMZ. Well, guess what? They're now developing even longer range artillery that can target all of Seoul and the areas south of it. And spending continued to be focused on the military capabilities of North Korea. A lot of people assess that North Korea spends far more than 30% of their GDP on the military. That is more like 50%. If you can just imagine that, in South Korea, the budget is about 2.8% of their GDP. Just unbelievable. And again, as I said, this is nested throughout my book. The new leadership focused on supporting Kim Jong-un, and I'll talk about that later on today. This was nested throughout everything that was going on from 2009 on. And by the way, if you're wondering how they supported all this money they're throwing at the military and their elite folks, I'll talk about that in a few minutes. So that was the military. Well, what were Kim Jong-il's choices for a successor in 2009? Why did he pick this guy who's 3 years younger than my oldest daughter to run a country of 22.5 million people that is involved in just about every kind of geopolitical shenanigans that is possible in Northeast Asia? Why did he do that? Well, everybody knows, I think, who looks at North Korea about his first son, who was caught trying to get into Tokyo Disney in Japan on a fake Slovenian passport. And as I've joked with my friends, I wish I could have been a fly on the wall there. Excuse me, sir, are you Slovenian? Oh, yes, I am a Slovenian. Yeah. So he lost a lot of street cred, if you will, with the leadership and his own father back in North Korea, and he's basically been living all over places like Europe, Switzerland, Macau, Hong Kong, etc. The second son, and this is not my quote, according to Kim Jong-il's Japanese chef, his second son was too much of a girly man, this is his words, not mine, to be a leader in North Korea. They actually tried, and it didn't go well. But he's not much older. That's Kim Jong-chol. He's not much older than Kim Jong-un anyway. But things didn't work out with him. So Kim was left with one son, and that was Kim Jong-un, and so that's the guy. 29 years old. In 2009, the regime succession process pretty much formally began. He started being called the young general, even though he's never served in the military, although he did have a poster of Michael Jordan up in his room in Bern, Switzerland, private school. And then we saw what those of us who watch North Korea always see, purges during the spring and summer of 2011, and this was designed to help build a power base for the third son. Okay, so you've built up the military, or maintained it, and you're building up certain things that are very important to continue to pose a threat to South Korea. So what do you do after you've brought these capabilities to the fore? Well, you conduct violent provocations, right? And so 2009, after we saw a lot of stuff like we just saw a few weeks ago that Bruce mentioned, lots of rhetoric and, calling the South Koreans imperialist lapdogs and whatever they call them, and calling us whatever they called us. We then saw in 2010, March of 2010, the sinking of the Chonan, and then November of 2010, we saw the artillery shelling of Yongpyong-do. So they built up these special capabilities, and then they used them. Now, why do I say asymmetric? Well, The Chonan was not sunk by a conventional sub. The Chonan was sunk by a Yono-class submarine that the North Koreans actually developed to sell to Iran. Why? Because that submarine is a small submarine that operates well in shallow, muddy waters like off the coast of Iran, and ironically, also the kind of waters that exist in the West Sea, near the northern limit line between the two Koreas. And it's a Special Operations Forces submarine. Why would I call an artillery attack asymmetric? Well, most people, we have some military guys and former military guys here in the audience, would acknowledge that South Korea's artillery is as good as American artillery for the most part. A lot of it is indigenously produced versions of American artillery. So why is this old Soviet artillery excuse me, why is this old Soviet artillery able to attack a South Korean island and they're not able to strike back as quickly as they want to? Because the North Koreans planned meticulously for this, and they were able to overwhelm Yeonpyeong Island by putting artillery right across the shore from them that hadn't been there before, and just surprising the South Koreans. Although I will tell you, that ain't going to happen again. The South Koreans are ready for those kind of attacks now. What's really interesting about this, and again, the nesting of the succession process, a few months after this happened, both attacks were attributed to the genius of Kim Jong-un in propaganda released to the North Korean military. Now, somebody is going to have to explain to me how a guy who's never been in the military planned this meticulous Special Operations Forces submarine attack where they went around the northern limit line and snuck in just the right shelf off the coast of North and South Korea and then were able to escape. Do you really think Kim Jong-il planned that? I'm guessing no. They might have let him sit in the room. Well, the guys who actually knew what they were doing planned it. But this is what I'm talking about. This is part of the propaganda indoctrination process. The genius of Kim Jong-un is driving us. That's what's needed to maintain his power in the nation. Well, what else did Kim Jong-il do to lay the groundwork for his son? I would also assert that he kept up the nuclear program that we saw a test of in February of this year. In fact, my guess is, and again, this is a guess, it's an assessment, not a conclusion based on fact. I played connect the dots. Based on the fact Iranians visited the test, and Iran does not have a plutonium program, based on the fact the North Koreans actually said it was a smaller, lighter weapon, and based on the fact that they went out of their way to make sure no particles escaped from the test, as they had before when we were able to determine what their tests were all about, it seems that this test could have been a highly enriched uranium test. We don't know because, at least in unclassified sources, we haven't seen any information that can definitively say one way or the other. But that's my guess. Mentioning the Iranians, collaboration, read proliferations, with the Iranians was ongoing during the final days of Kim Jong-il, stepped up, as it is now. Why is this important to North Korea? Because the Iranians pay the North Koreans hundreds of millions of dollars a year for missile programs, for their nuclear collaboration, for conventional weapons, even for stuff like what I described earlier, that Yono-class submarine. Very important for the cash flow, the real economy of North Korea. And it's important to point out that North Korea's nuclear weaponization program was Kim Il-sung's dream. It's now carried on by his grandson. And believe me, the North Koreans see it that way. It's part of the dynastic process in North Korea that this dream by the great leader has now been carried on through the dear leader and by the young general. Does that make sense to you? So I actually wrote a chapter, as I talked about, in my book where I lay out what the capabilities are that the North Koreans have, and brings us right up to date through February of this year. And then I talk about what they could do with those capabilities, and then I talk about the kinds of countermeasures that we can take, and talk about recent initiatives that the ROK-US alliance has taken. So hopefully you'll enjoy reading that chapter. There is more that Kim Jong-il did to set his son up for survival. And this was probably the most enjoyable chapter for me to write. I really enjoyed writing this chapter, and that is they have proliferation to state and non-state actors. And please allow me to point out that many of the state actors that North Korea proliferates to also support terrorism, e.g., Iran, e.g., Eritrea, e.g., Syria. And I think it's very interesting that we have not seen a lot in the news about North Korea supplying the Syrians. Just so you know, North Korea supplies a lot of stuff to the North Koreans, and North Korea supplies a lot of stuff to the Syrians, I should say, and has in the past. Things such as a chemical weapons facility, artillery, Scud missiles, etc. Lots and lots of stuff. So very interesting stuff. In the chapter that I write, I take you from how it all started to how they got to where they are today. And it originally started in the Cold War, when North Korea was doing the bidding of the USSR. And what the North Koreans did in 1990 when they got cut off from, not cut off, but when the USSR cut off their subsidies, was they took those networks that they had built on during the Cold War era, and they started using those networks to set up new networks of nations they could supply arms to, and non-state actors. Let me give you some examples, and I give you specific examples with lots of endnotes and lots of data to prove it. Terrorist organizations that they have supported or are supporting now include the Tamil Tigers, which was one of North Korea's best customers right up until the Sri Lankan army drove them into the sea. Hezbollah, IRA through counterfeiting, obviously the Iranian Republican Guard Corps, Al-Shabaab, and according to some sources, but I was not able to verify it, so I'll put it out there like that, even Al-Qaeda back in 2007. So support to terrorist groups included and includes, and goes on right now, arms sales, training, and construction of facilities. And if I could give you just one example of that, talking about Hezbollah, they sell arms to Hezbollah through the IRGC in Iran, through Syria, and they sell arms to them directly. And I give you examples of all three of those in the chapter in the book. They also train the Hezbollah guys. According to some reports, about 100 Hezbollah commanders went back to North Korea in 2007 after the war with the Israeli Defense Forces and were trained by the Recon Bureau in North Korea. For those of you who don't know what the Recon Bureau is, it is the elite arm, one of the elite arms of their Special Operations Forces. And they do construction of facilities for these guys. For example, they built massive, like miles-long underground facilities for Hezbollah that made it very difficult for the Israelis to get at them during their 2006 war. Important to note, this goes on today under Kim Jong-un. Why do they do this? Is it about ideology? Is it about, despising the United States or Israel? Well, it certainly doesn't hurt that we are who we are. But these are highly profitable activities that put cash into the coffers of the elite and support the military. And that's what's really going on. So these are the kinds of things that were stepped up toward the end of the Kim Jong-il regime and that we still see going on today. So what happened in 2010? We know that in 2011 we saw Kim Jong-un within weeks rushed into all these positions. But how did they set him up for that, or attempt to set him up for that? Well, in 2010 he was appointed the vice chair of the Central Military Commission, and he was also given positions in the party and the security services, though not senior positions. The young general, as he was called then, at this time frame was surrounded by senior-level people handpicked by his father to assure his power base. At the same time, younger members of the elite loyal to Kim Jong-un were rushed into key positions throughout the government. Unfortunately, many of these people were no more experienced than Kim Jong-un. So you can see what's coming. How does that work out for stability? So what does the dear lead, not the dear leader, what is the young general? What does Kim Jong-un need to survive? And by the way, Jong-un is also the name of my wife. So when we lived in Virginia, her license plate said Jong-un. And so, right before we moved to Texas, people would be honking at her, she's going, why are they honking at me? I don't know why they're honking at me. So it was interesting stuff. But anyhow, what the leader of North Korea needs to survive. In order to keep the country from imploding, he must have a power base just like his father and just like his grandfather. he must have the support of four key institutions: the party, the military, the security services, and that Byzantine thing that my good friend Dave Maxwell calls the KFR, the inner Kim family circle, or the Kim family regime. This really is not some type of weird nebulous thing. What this is the sons, the grandsons, and the great-grandsons of the people that came up with Kim Il-sung. They're still there. They're the royalty. They're the Yangban, for you Koreans sitting here in the audience. They're the nobles and the royal family that is the Kim family running North Korea. Those are the four institutions. The way the Kim family regime works is it's not a hierarchical setup like this. It's actually a guy in the middle of a circle, and the institutions feed into him. Since 1948, since Kim Il-sung took over, it's always been nobody even controls an entire institution. Even the institutions are split up, but all of the institutions feed into a guy. That guy was Kim Il-sung. Now it's Kim Jong-un. It was Kim Jong-il. So if that guy is not a capable leader, you got a problem. So what are Kim Jong-un's chances of survival, since he's 3 years younger than my oldest daughter and he's got all these negatives going against him? Well, I'd like you to think about this. These are practical, common sense things. They're not complicated. Kim Jong-il had 20 years to build a power base in those four key institutions I talked about. When Kim Il-sung died in 1994, Kim Jong-il was already a marshal in the army, head of the party, and running the security services. Kim Jong-un had none of these positions when his father died, and a much shorter time to build his power base. As my good friend Pak Sun-jae, who I had lunch with today at the Old Ebbitt Grill, I might add, he said something to me about 5 years ago that I thought was very important, and that's Kim Jong-il is weaker than his father. The next son will be weaker than Kim Jong-il. The question is, how much weaker? Because how much weaker he is points to how long the regime will survive. And that's key. I'd like to thank you for that, and you're in my endnotes. So that's an issue. What's the solution? Well, currently we have what some have called a caretaker government. You've got Kim Jong-il's hand-picked trusted advisors that are currently helping to run the government, with Kim Jong-un up front as the face of the DPRK. And as I said on a radio show yesterday, when I was asked, how much in charge is Kim Jong-un? And I said, well, those four institutions feed into him. They do exactly what he tells them to do. Of course, he doesn't really know what he's doing yet, so what he tells them to do is exactly what they tell him to do. Think about that. A nation of 22.5 million people, that's really the way it's working right now. No one man is truly controlling that government right now. That's a problem, because that's always the way it's been. It's never, the government of the DPRK has never operated this way before. That means that the government of the DPRK is at its most unstable since 1948. There's just no getting around it. Well, since I've given you this depressing set of circumstances, which are also in my book, what can we expect in the next 2 to 5 years? Well, Kim Jong-un will need time to build a power base that he did not have when his father died, like Kim Jong-il had when Kim Il-sung died. Currently, the key institutions are really running in a different way than they have in the past, somewhat on their own. Even though they have a leader, the leader does not have the background or experience yet to be making a lot of the judgment calls he should be. If a crisis occurs, a real crisis, not one that's self-generated by the North Koreans like we saw a few weeks ago, it could cause the government to implode, explode, or fall into anarchy. So what are the negative scenarios? Well, let me talk about those, because we've seen some of those, and oh, everybody's laughing. What, you mean the other stuff wasn't negative? Some of the scenarios that I've seen talked about in the press, I'd just like to address, because I talk about this in the book as well in the last chapter. A military coup. I think that's highly unlikely because of the power of the security services. Again, one of the key institutions. The security services spy on everybody in the country, and they spy on each other. If you are a general in the North Korean People's Army, and you're planning an exercise, on your left shoulder is a guy from the General Political Bureau. On your right shoulder is a guy from the MSC, which is the military version of the State Security Department. So how many people here saw Hunt for Red October? All the old people. I got it, yeah. Well, do you remember in that movie, there's a scene where Sean Connery has to kill his political officer before he can take over the submarine? Well, if you're a North Korean, you got to kill two guys because they got two guys that are overlooking their shoulders. And as Bruce knows, within the power structure of the North Korean People's Army, the real power structure, the General Political Bureau guy has always been either the most powerful guy or one of the most powerful guys. It's because that's who the Kim family has always trusted. So interesting. I do not think that that's likely. How about a palace coup? Again, I think this is unlikely because of the security services, because everybody's watching everybody else. Well, what about a civil war? This is possible if the military splinters because of a lack of control. In other words, it wouldn't be guys decide to start fighting each other. It could just simply be Kim Jong-un and those around him don't have adequate control of the military and things start to splinter. Yes, that could start a civil war. But the scenario that I think is most likely to happen, if it does, is collapse. And this is most likely to happen if Kim Jong-un or someone does not consolidate power in North Korea. And we haven't seen him completely do that yet. He's still in the build-up phase. So this is something that we'll be watching. I think all of us in this room will probably be watching it in coming months and years. So what if Kim Jong-un consolidates his power over the next 18 months? If Kim Jong-un is able to consolidate his power, it is possible the government will stabilize. If stability is to occur, it can only happen, and this is important, it can only happen in the same model as Kim Jong-il and Kim Il-sung is used. In other words, Kim Jong-un can't take a new script and say, this is how I'm going to run the country. It's not going to happen. He can't do it. It's not possible under this system. Which is why, and a lot of you read the stuff that Dave Maxwell writes from Georgetown, Dave talked about this so-called economic reform that people were talking about that Kim Jong-un was talking about initiating. It never happened. Why didn't it happen? Because Kim Jong-un, in order to simply survive, must follow the same script as his father and his grandfather. He can't get off that script or the government will collapse. Thus, following that same script means continued provocations and brinkmanship, continued nuclear weaponization program, continued proliferation to rogue states and non-state actors, continued illicit activities, and massive purges internally. And yes, folks, we have seen all of that since Kim Jong-un took over in December of 2011. The elite in North Korea, that 5 to 50,000 people that are part of that Kim family inner circle, they want Kim Jong-un to succeed because they know this is a dynastic government. You've got to have a guy from the Kim family running the show. The question is, can he do it? And that's still a question that's unanswered. So what's my assessment? My assessment is that Kim Jong-un has a 50-50 chance of succeeding as the leader of the DPRK. Some of you are going to ask me, why do you say 50-50 and not 40-60? And my answer is, I don't know. The real answer is, we don't know. We're guessing. That's what 50-50 means. And I think that that's still up in the air. If Kim Jong-un fails, the DPRK fails. And thus, implosion, explosion, or civil war are the most likely scenarios. Seoul and Washington and the free world must plan accordingly. A collapsed North Korea most likely means a unified Korea, perhaps by force, under a liberal democracy with the capital in Seoul. In my mind, and I say this in the book, the worst scenario is if Kim Jong-un and those who support him are actually able to survive and control the government and the country. This means the misery and instability on the Korean Peninsula will just go on and on. And I'll stop there.
You willing to take questions?
Sure.
All right, let me do the prerogative of the host and ask the first one. A question that often comes up is, to what degree is Kim Jong-un calling the shots? Is he he's simply following a script by his father, and he may veer from that down the road? Is he pursuing the policies he wants to pursue? Or, as some argue, there's factionalism in the North Korean regime, and that really, against his better judgment, he's having to do these provocations and tough actions because of the evil hardliners, the military or security services?
Well, that's an excellent question. I think you know the answer to it already, but it's a very good question. We've talked, in fact, you and I have talked about this. People talk about the government of North Korea as if it's the government of the PRC, China. It's not. So when people say hardliners and softliners, man, you're a Kim liner, or you're 6 feet under. That's just the way it is. And so if North Korea took a softer stance, it was because Kim Jong-il wanted it in the past. If they took a harder stance, it's because Kim Jong-il wanted it. Now, did his generals suggest things to him and his party guys? Absolutely. But you agreed with the dear leader, or you died, or you ended up in Camp 942 or whatever, 913. It's a little different now because it has to be under Kim Jong-un. Because the biggest problem Kim Jong-un has is he doesn't know what he doesn't know. He doesn't have the background or experience to make these judgment calls on major geopolitical decisions within Northeast Asia that the leader of a nation has to make. He just doesn't have that experience or background or judgment to do it yet. So I believe he's taking a lot. I mean, they're not ordering him to do anything, I don't think, but I think he's taking a lot of advice and doing what a lot of people want besides just himself in running this government. Because I think that right now it's really a group that's helping Kim Jong-un make those decisions. He knows he's not able to make those decisions on his own yet. That may change in 3 to 5 years, and if the government stabilizes, which I think would be a bad thing, things may go back to the way they were under Kim Jong-il. We'll have to see, but right now, his judgment is weak because of his lack of a power base, that he wasn't able to build the way his father did, and because he just doesn't have the background or experience that his father did, or the street cred, for lack of a better term, that Kim Il-sung had when he took over. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does.
Thanks.
Why don't you just pick out?
Dr. Nish.
Thanks, Bruce. There is a new report that just came out the other day, and I made a note of it. I think it's from one of the Japanese newspapers. My memory has faded already on it. But the report quotes sources in Beijing that the Chinese government has developed a contingency plan for bringing down Kim Jong-un and replacing him with the older brother, Kim Jong-nam, who is, I think, in Macau right now. Whether there's anything to this, I don't think we can make a judgment. But when you talk about this Kim family circle of 5,000 or 50,000 North Koreans, in your research, did you pick up any sense of how much of an inroad have the Chinese made into this group? What kind of contacts do the Chinese have with these people, or other kinds of influence with this family circle, this power elite? A lot of them do go to China, I know. They go to buy their luxury goods and shopping and other things. So they're more exposed to the Chinese to some degree, more than the masses of the North Koreans.
That's a great point, Larry. And by the way, you're in my endnotes too in the book, as you were in my first two. But certainly Chongsung Tech is noted for being very close to the Chinese, and the Chinese are said to be, I mean, who knows if it's true or not, the Chinese are said to get along well with him, Chinese officials. And there, as you said, there are lots of other officials and the elite who the Kim family regime can trust to go back and forth across the border, who purchase luxury items in China, et cetera. I don't think that means, at least that I can see, it means they have inroads into the governmental infrastructure of North Korea. I just haven't seen that. That may happen more so now that the government's weaker, which it obviously is. It's much less stable than it was under Kim Jong-il, except during that stroke period. So they may be able to make some inroads. But as you know, both Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il were very they were very standoffish with the Chinese. Although they both went up to Beijing and did things with the Chinese. It will be interesting to see how Kim Jong-un works with the Chinese. I did read that report that you're talking about in the Japanese press, and I think it's very interesting, although since you and I both know all about Kim Jong-nam, gosh, it seems kind of out there that the North Korean leadership would accept Kim Jong-nam as the next guy, because he has this, I hate to put it in these words, but he has such a reputation everywhere, including North Korea, as being a goofball, and he's gone in the open press, as we all know, and said horrible things about, his father and his brothers, and, you just got to wonder, is that really the kind of guy that would be able to run those key institutions of the country? I would think not. But nevertheless, never say never. I mean, if you and I had been drinking beer 5 or 6 years ago and said we'd see a 29-year-old leader of North Korea, I'd have said, you're nuts. But look, here we are, so never say never. It just doesn't seem real likely, at least for now, as far as I can tell. Does that make sense to you? Yes, sir.
How much danger do you think the United States actually is in terms of from North Korea's nuclear military testing that we were talking about, or maybe from support from the Russians or from China? I've heard China didn't come out and say exactly they're not going to come out and fully support North Koreans' actions, but they didn't. They also said they weren't going to support nuclear actions towards the United States or something along those lines. If I'm correct, right?
Yeah, I'm sure you've seen a lot of the rhetoric that's been ongoing, and it stopped, about a month ago? The heavy rhetoric, we can hit Washington, and, well, no, they can't. That 3-stage missile that they tested can probably hit at least, and it went through all 3 stages, so we can now say they've done a successful test, probably could at least hit Alaska and Hawaii. At best, the west coast of the United States. Tell me if I'm wrong. I think that's what the range most guys agree on. So they don't have anything that can hit Washington. As far as I know, putting a nuke on an ICBM, they're just not there yet, as far as I know. And as my friends know, I always say, I don't make assessments based on a lack of evidence. I'm a former intel officer. I make assessments based on evidence. And the evidence right now says that there's a real good chance the North Koreans could put a nuke on a no-dong missile. And a no-dong missile has a range of 1,500 kilometers, which means it could hit Tokyo. But that's about as far as I can see, based on the evidence, as they've come. So if they have an HEU warhead, if that's what they tested, and that's a big if, obviously, if that's an HEU warhead, and if they could put it on a missile, the most likely missile would be the no-dong, because the Pakistanis already can do it. So if the Pakistanis can do it, and the North Koreans were working with the Pakistanis right up until 2003, the chances are very good they can do it. That's where they're at right now, I think. Now, they may have some technology capability that we haven't seen in open sources yet, and if that's so, then they're farther along. But everything I've seen shows right now they probably have the capability to put a nuke on a missile and hit Japan. That's where they're at right now. And there's no hard proof of that either. It's just plain connect the dots. It looks like where they're at. Does that make sense to you? And in the nuclear chapter, I actually walked the reader through that. Here's where they developed their HEU program. Here's when they developed their no-dong. Here's the programs they had with the Pakistanis. Here's where they are now. So you can actually see why I assess that it's likely to have that capability. Does that make sense to you?
Let me just jump in. 2 additions is when, a lot of times when people are trying to sort of downplay the North Korean threat, they'll say, well, it can probably only hit Alaska and Hawaii. Last time I checked, they're part of the United States.
True.
And also the West Coast. And the South Koreans, when they dredged up the parts of the missile from the December launch, the Minister of Defense said, we assess it could hit the United States. Now, whether he meant Hawaii and Alaska or the West Coast or what. And then the other thing is, if we assess today they could do that, well, there's no indications that that's where the quest stops. You know, that they want to have that capability of threatening the entire United States. And North Korea's statements of the last 6 months have been, we can hit the United States today. We have miniaturized, diversified warheads, and by diversified, we think that means HEU and plutonium. So, you know, where they are today, and then where they will be next week, next month, next year. So, you know, we know what path they're on. If the, you know, hitting Washington with a nuke is Z on an A to Z, maybe they're at T, maybe they're at W, we don't know, but we know they want to get to Z.
Exactly. And in the book, I take that quote from the Minister of National Defense, where he actually describes, they found the first stage of that tapeodong, the successful tapeodong test, they found it out in the West Sea, and then they ran a simulation on it. And what they saw was, okay, this stage, one of the stages was 4 no-dong engines wrapped together, then another stage was a Scud engine. Essentially, the North Koreans took technology that we said was too primitive to successfully launch a 3-stage missile, and they successfully launched a 3-stage missile. That's I mean, they did it. We can't deny it anymore. But I would tell you, and again, this is in the book, if North Korea, just because they don't have a missile that can hit the Washington, D.C. area, it doesn't mean that they couldn't do something like putting a primitive plutonium bomb on a merchant ship, changing flags in several ports before they got in the United States, which they're very good at, and then sailing that thing into Norfolk Harbor and killing 80,000 people like that. That's a capability they have right now today, and that's a fact. That's not an assessment. And that's something, you know, I lay out that scenario in the book as well. And the North Koreans are very good at doing asymmetric things like that, where afterwards us or the South Koreans are going, gee whiz, I never thought of that. You know, they're just very good at that. So just something to think about. Other comments? Colonel Maxwell?
Thanks, Bruce. Great presentation.
Thank you, sir.
You talked about the playbook, which I think is very important, that the Kim family regime has been following the playbook. I think in this, the last few months, though, I think that the ROK-US alliance has not followed the playbook. And I think that, we know the agreement that's been signed between South Korea and the United States to respond to provocations. And I think when North Korea does conduct a kinetic provocation where people will be at risk, I think South Korea is going to respond decisively at the time and point of that provocation. And at that point, we are really going to be off script for North Korea. And I think the strength of the ROK-US alliance, in recent years, I don't think it's been as strong as it is now. But that takes North Korea off script. How do you think that, and obviously this is pure speculation, but when we don't respond the way that we have for the last 60 years, how is that going to impact Kim Jong-Un and the Kim family regime decision-making? Can you speculate on that?
Very good stuff. Let me get to some of the things that he talks about, because they are in the book, in the chapter where I talk about the Northern Limit Line. Our good friend and my mentor, Bob Collins, said something at a conference 3 years ago that was very important. He said, since 1953, the ROK-US alliance has been very good at deterring force-on-force conflict on the Korean Peninsula. We have not been very good at deterring provocations. And that is something that the ROKs in 2010, our South Korean allies, said, enough's enough. We're done with this. We're taking concrete measures. And they changed the rules of engagement in the Northern Limit Line area and along the DMZ. They formed a new command, the Northwest Islands Command, out there to give a 2-star general, a ROK Marine general, the authority to instantly respond however he needs to respond. In other words, if Yeonpyeong-do were to happen tomorrow, he wouldn't have to call back to MND headquarters to get permission to send F-15Ks wherever they need to go into North Korea. He just does it. He now has that authority. The rules of engagement have changed. And Dave's a planner, so this is something I know he likes. The South Koreans and the U.S. now have a plan, a counter-provocation plan, which obviously I don't get to look at because I don't have a clearance anymore, but they actually have a plan for what they're going to do and the role that the Americans will play in supporting our ROC allies. So I think, you know what I think is happening right now is, and one of the things I talk about in my book is the fact that they're always changing their TTP, their tactics, techniques, and procedures. They're planning right now. Kim Kyok-shik, I know, is leading the planning. They're saying, how are we going to get around these measures that the South Korean imperialist lackeys and the American dogs are making? How do we get around these procedures? They're doing that now. And, you know, as we've seen in the past, 1999, South Korea and North Korea get involved in a naval battle in the Northern Limit Line. And it started off with two ships just ramming each other. And next thing you know, a North Korean guy fires at the South Koreans, and they just wiped them out. I mean, essentially sank the ship. And the North Koreans waited 3 years. And in 2002, they sank a South Korean ship just for revenge. That's the way the North Korean government operates. In 2009, there was another incident in the NLL where a North Korean ship tried to go after a South Korean ship, only the South Koreans were ready this time. They surrounded the North Korean ship and poured about 4,500 rounds. Let me repeat that. 4,500 rounds into that North Korean ship, and it sank on the way back to port. 2010, what did they do? They attacked a South Korean ship, the Jong-Un, with a submarine. So if everything goes according to our plan, and they try something and we're able to counter it, you can bet there'll be payback later. The North Koreans will be planning for it. That's what I think is likely to happen. I think that as long as there is a North Korea, as long as there is a DPRK, we're going to see this constant boom, boom, you did this, now we're going to do this. It's just never going to stop. Does that make sense to you? Any other questions? Well, thank you for coming.
Well, thank you very much.
Appreciate it.